Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at something I think we've all thought about.
Okay.
Why is it that we sometimes root for the bad guys?
Yeah.
You know, those villains or antagonists or whatever you want to call them, that really kind of blur the lines.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be using Decoding the Shades of Gray, villains, anti-villains, and anti-heroes to help us with this deep dive.
Well, I think you've hit on something really crucial there, and that is that human nature
Yeah.
is complex. And not just in fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, in the real world, too, right?
Right.
None of us are purely good or purely evil.
Right.
And these character archetypes, I think, help us to make sense of that.
Okay, so let's get started with the classic villain. And we've
Right.
got tons of examples,
Yes.
like Voldemort from Harry Potter,
Yeah.
or Darth Vader, before his redemption, or even Cruella de Vil.
All right. Yeah.
These are characters that just seem to revel in being bad.
So what is it that unites these characters? I think there are some core traits.
Okay.
They're motivated by really selfish desires.
Okay.
Power, greed, just disruption.
Right.
Think about the Joker's obsession with just disrupting social norms.
Yeah.
Or Darth Vader's pursuit of power at any cost.
Mm-hmm.
They really have this need for control, and other people are just pawns in their game.
And their methods.
Yeah.
I mean, let's just say they're not winning any humanitarian awards.
No.
They lie, they cheat, they steal, they kill to get what they want. And they have zero empathy.
Yeah, and you can even look at this from a psychological perspective.
Okay.
And you can kind of see how some villains might be trapped in these early stages of moral development,
Oh.
where they're only thinking about themselves and how to avoid punishment.
Mm-hmm.
They just haven't developed that sense of empathy or even an understanding of how their actions impact other people.
Which makes them the easiest to spot, I guess,
Right.
and the easiest to root against.
Yeah.
But then things get a lot more interesting when we get to the anti-villains.
Yes.
Now, this is where I think it gets really interesting,
Mm-hmm.
because these are the characters that I think make us question our own moral compass.
Absolutely. I mean, think about Thanos from the Avengers.
Right.
I mean, obviously his methods were horrific.
Yeah, wiping out half the universe.
I mean, that's not a gentle solution.
No.
But he really believed that he was acting for the greater good,
Right.
that it was necessary to save the universe from overpopulation.
Right. He thought the ends justified the means,
Exactly.
which is a very dangerous
Yes.
mindset to have.
Yeah.
But his motivation, I mean, it was twisted, but it was rooted in a belief system.
Yeah.
I mean, Thanos' thinking was probably influenced by the Malthusian theory,
Mm-hmm.
which argues that population growth will inevitably outstrip resources.
Right.
So even though his actions were, villainous,
Yeah.
his goal, you can see the logic.
There was a logic to it.
You kind of squint.
Yeah. A very flawed logic, but a logic nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think that's why we often feel a sense of sympathy for these characters.
Even as we recognize that what they're doing is horrible,
Yes.
we can understand their logic even if we don't agree with it.
Exactly. And that's what makes anti-villains so compelling.
Right.
They really challenge us to confront this ends justify the means dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
Is it ever okay to inflict harm, even on a massive scale,
Right.
if you believe it's going to lead to a greater good?
Right.
This is a question philosophers have debated for centuries,
Yeah.
and it's one that really resonates with audiences.
Magneto from X-Men is another good example of an anti-villain.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, his desire to protect mutant kind,
Yeah.
even if it meant resorting to violence,
Mm-hmm.
came from his experience with persecution.
Right.
He's like a cautionary tale showing how trauma and a righteous cause can be twisted into something destructive.
Absolutely.
And we can even find a blueprint for the anti-villain in real-world history.
Yeah.
Think about figures like Robespierre during the French Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
He believed he was creating a more just society.
But his methods were brutal
Yeah.
and ultimately led to the Reign of Terror.
And what's fascinating here
Yeah.
is that the line between villain and anti-villain
Yeah.
can be so thin.
Right.
It really often comes down to perspective.
Yeah.
One person's villain is another person's freedom fighter.
And that brings us to, I think, the most slippery and the most relatable character of all,
Okay.
the anti-hero. And for this one, we have to talk about Han Solo.
Ah, Han Solo.
Yeah.
The quintessential lovable rogue.
Yes.
He starts out as a smuggler,
Right.
completely motivated by self-preservation.
Yeah.
He's got these questionable tactics, bends the rules whenever it suits him,
Right.
shoots first and asks questions later.
Right.
But he's not evil. He's
Right.
just complicated.
He is, and I think that's why we find him so endearing.
Yeah.
He's not a perfect hero,
Right.
but he's got this heart of gold under that rough exterior.
Yeah.
He's the guy who shows up at the last minute to save the day, even though he swore he wouldn't get involved.
Yeah. Anti-heroes really operate in this gray area between good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
They're often driven by self-interest,
Mm-hmm.
but they can also have these moments of heroism.
Yeah.
They might even have a strong moral code, but it's very personal.
Yeah.
And it often conflicts with kind of societal norms.
Think about Severus Snape.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he does some pretty morally ambiguous things,
He does.
but ultimately his motivations are rooted in love and loyalty.
Yeah.
He challenges our perceptions of heroism, showing us that it's not always about grand gestures
Right.
or unwavering righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's about these quiet acts of sacrifice driven by very personal motivations.
Right, absolutely. I mean, that's what makes anti-heroes so relatable.
Yeah.
We all have flaws, we all make mistakes,
Uh-huh.
and sometimes we have to make choices that aren't, perfectly moral.
Yeah, I think we see ourselves in those messy contradictions.
Right?
Where our actions don't perfectly align with our intentions.
Exactly.
And that's what makes stories with anti-heroes so compelling. They hold a mirror up to our own imperfections.
It's like that scene in A Few Good Men
Oh, yeah.
where Tom Cruise's character orders the code red,
Right.
even though he knows it's against the rules.
Yeah.
He believes he's doing what's necessary to protect his unit, but his actions have these tragic consequences.
Right.
And it really forces us to grapple with those gray areas
Mhm.
where right and wrong just aren't so clear-cut.
Now that we've explored these three archetypes in detail,
Yeah.
the villain, the anti-villain, and the anti-hero,
Mm-hmm.
would it be helpful to kind of synthesize all this information
That's a great idea.
just to make sure we're all on the same page?
I think it's easy to get lost in the nuances
Yeah,
of
no.
each category. So let's create like a framework
Okay.
to clarify the distinctions.
All right.
So imagine we have a table,
Hmm.
and across the top row, we have our three archetypes:
Okay.
villain, anti-villain, and anti-hero.
Got it.
And then down the left-hand column, we'll list the key aspects that define them. So motivations, methods, morality, and audience reactions.
Okay, I'm picturing the table. Let's start with the villain.
Okay.
What are their primary motivations?
So villains are typically driven by selfish desires,
Okay.
power, greed, revenge,
Yeah.
a need to dominate others.
Yeah.
Like, think about Scar from The Lion King.
Oh, yeah.
He wants power, and he's willing to murder his own brother to get it.
Right.
His actions are driven purely by self-interest, no regard for the well-being of others.
And their methods,
Yeah,
they're not exactly known for playing by the rules.
definitely not. They'll lie, they'll cheat, they'll manipulate,
Mm-hmm.
they'll even resort to violence to achieve their goals.
Okay.
And their morality is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
They're bad to the bone.
Right.
And as an audience, we're usually rooting for their downfall.
Right.
We want to see justice prevail.
Yeah.
And we feel a sense of satisfaction when the villain gets their comeuppance.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right.
Now let's move on to the anti-villain. What sets their motivations apart from the villain?
So anti-villains are where things get a little more complex.
Okay.
Their motivations might actually align with some kind of greater good,
Right.
but it's usually twisted or misguided.
Like Thanos wants to
Yeah.
balance the universe.
Yeah, he really believes that he's saving the universe
That's right.
from collapse, even though his methods are horrific.
Right. It's that ends justify the means dilemma again.
Exactly. And that's where their methods become so problematic.
Yeah.
They're often extreme,
Right.
morally questionable,
Mhm.
and they can inflict a lot of harm,
Yeah.
even if they believe it's for a noble purpose.
So their morality is really blurry.
It's really blurry.
Okay.
They often have a tragic backstory or some redeeming qualities
Mm.
that make us sympathize with them.
Yeah.
Even if we disagree with their actions,
Right.
we might see glimpses of good intentions,
Yeah.
but they're overshadowed by these really destructive choices.
And what about the audience? How does the audience react to the anti-villain?
Well, it's not as simple as with the villain.
Right.
We're not just rooting against them.
Mm-hmm.
We might actually find ourselves drawn to them,
Yeah.
even as we recognize, the horror of what they're doing.
Right.
We might admire their conviction
Yeah.
or their willingness to sacrifice,
Okay.
even if we question their methods.
Think about Killmonger
Oh, yeah, great example.
from Black Panther.
Yeah.
He had a legitimate grievance,
He did.
but his solution was very extreme.
It was.
All right, now let's tackle the final category.
Okay.
The anti-hero. What makes them so unique?
Well, I think anti-heroes are the ultimate rule breakers.
Okay.
Their motivations are often more about self-interest or survival.
Right.
They're not necessarily trying to save the world
Yeah.
or achieve some big goal.
Right.
They're just trying to get by.
Yeah.
And they're willing to do whatever it takes to survive.
Like Han Solo.
Exactly.
You know, he's not driven by ideology or altruism.
Right.
He's just trying to make a living in this very dangerous galaxy.
Yeah.
And that involves, bending or breaking the rules.
Absolutely. And their methods are often a mix of good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
They might do some shady things.
Right.
But they also have these moments of heroism.
Like Jack Sparrow.
Yeah.
He's a pirate, but he also has a knack for saving the day.
He does often by accident.
But he gets it done.
Yeah.
And their morality, it's definitely complex.
It is. They have their own code of ethics,
Well,
even if it doesn't always align with society's rules.
And I think that's why we love them.
Yeah.
They're flawed, they're unpredictable, and they really make us question our own definitions of right and wrong.
Absolutely.
We see ourselves in their imperfections, their willingness to challenge authority, their refusal to conform.
I think, to sum it all up, we've got our villains.
Right.
Driven by selfish desires, ruthless in their methods, easy to root against. Then you have your anti-villains, motivated by this twisted sense of good, using extreme and often harmful methods,
Right.
and leaving us with very conflicted feelings.
Yeah.
And finally, we have our beloved anti-heroes,
Right.
guided by self-interest, operating in that moral gray area.
Yeah.
And often the characters we find ourselves most drawn to.
But the thing is, these categories aren't fixed.
Right? They're not set in stone.
Characters can evolve over time.
Absolutely.
And their actions can shift them from one archetype to another.
I mean, think about Darth Vader's redemption arc
Oh, yeah.
in Return of the Jedi.
Right.
I mean, he starts out as this ruthless villain,
Yeah.
but ultimately sacrifices himself to save his son.
Right.
I mean, that's a shift toward anti-heroism.
It is, and that's what makes stories so dynamic.
Yeah.
It's like real life.
It is like real life.
We're constantly changing, evolving, making choices that shape who we are.
Absolutely.
And sometimes those choices surprise us.
They do.
They might even blur the lines between who we thought we were and who we're becoming.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to look beyond these simple labels.
Right.
And try to understand the nuances of human behavior.
Because when we categorize people too quickly, we risk missing out on their complexities, their contradictions, and ultimately their humanity.
And that leads us to, I think, a really crucial question.
Okay.
Why does all of this matter?
Yeah.
Why should we care about these character archetypes?
Right. What can we learn from them?
I mean, it's entertaining to analyze fictional characters.
Yeah.
But how does this translate to the real world?
That's a great point.
I'm glad you asked that. Because understanding these archetypes goes way beyond entertainment.
Okay.
It gives you a framework for understanding human motivation, both in fiction and in reality.
So it's like a lens through which we can view the world.
Exactly.
And it can help us make sense of, these complex behaviors and motivations.
Absolutely. Think about it.
Okay.
How often do we make these snap judgments about people based on very limited information?
Yeah, we label someone a villain because of one action we saw.
Exactly, or a news headline.
Yeah.
But if we take the time to understand their backstory, their motivations, their struggles, we might see them in a completely different light.
We might even recognize that we have more in common with them than we initially thought.
Absolutely, and that's the power of these archetypes.
Okay.
They remind us that the world isn't black and white.
Yeah.
It's full of shades of gray.
It really is. And embracing those shades of gray, I think, allows us to approach the world with more empathy, more understanding, and ultimately more compassion. So like when we encounter someone and we think, oh, they're a villain,
right?
Maybe instead of just writing them off, we should think, well, hold on, what led them to this point? What experiences have they had that have made them who they are?
Yeah, it's about challenging those knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah.
And remembering that everyone has a story.
Right.
And those stories are often a lot more complex than we might initially assume.
Right.
I mean, it's like in literature.
Yeah.
Real life is full of plot twists and character development.
It really is. So what does all of this mean for us?
Yeah.
How can we take this understanding of villains and anti-villains and anti-heroes and apply it to our everyday lives?
Well, I think it goes back to that critical thinking mindset we were talking about.
Okay.
When you encounter conflict or when you're trying to make sense of someone's actions,
right?
Just ask yourself, okay, what archetype are they reflecting? What might be driving their behavior?
So we've got this new toolkit now.
You do.
For decoding human behavior.
Yeah, you've got a new lens for looking at the world.
That's awesome.
It is. It's exciting.
It really is.
It helps you navigate those messy situations that don't fit neatly into good or bad categories.
Right.
It encourages you to seek understanding
right.
before rushing to judgment.
It's like we've got this secret decoder ring now for figuring out human behavior.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And you know what's really amazing is that it's not just about understanding fictional characters.
Right.
It's about understanding ourselves and the people around us.
That's such a good point.
It's really powerful because it reminds us that we all have the potential for both good and bad.
Yeah.
And that it's our choices.
Right.
It's our actions.
Yeah.
That ultimately define who we are.
So before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
I want you to think about a time when you misjudged someone, you know, maybe based on a first impression or a stereotype.
Right.
You labeled them too quickly without really understanding their story.
Yeah, ask yourself, how would my perception of that person change? If I looked at them through this lens of these archetypes, would I see them differently?
Right. Would I have more empathy or understanding?
Exactly, because the world is full of complexities.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to embrace those complexities, to look beyond the surface, and to approach every interaction with a sense of curiosity and open-mindedness.
Because the most interesting stories, the most fascinating people, they're rarely black and white.
Right.
It's in those shades of gray.
It is.
Where we discover just how amazing and how rich human experience can be.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Really enjoyed it.
Me too.
Until next time.